All right. So welcome everybody to Socialists and the Uprising Against Racism. My name is Brian Bean. I'm with Tempest Magazine and an editor for Rampant Magazine. And so I'm going to introduce the meeting, the sponsors, and then our panelists, and then we'll get into it. So this meeting is, of course, about the current uprising that's sweeping the country, and everybody is talking about it because it's transformed politics as we know it. And this meeting is going to focus a little bit on the question of socialists and the uprisings, how we've related questions and strategic and tactical questions that come up about DSA and sort of those sorts of things that hopefully will be a vibrant conversation. The meeting is sponsored by Tempest Magazine, which is a forthcoming socialist magazine that aims to be a space to have conversations such as these about politics and strategy and tactics that are needed in this new socialist anti-racist movement. Rampant Magazine, DSA Madison branch, New Politics Magazine, the DSA Emerge caucus, and the Red Bloom Communist Collective. So they're the sponsors for today's discussion. Our panelists are going to be Justin Charles, who's an organizer with DSA Emerge, Michael Esealuka, who serves on the steering committee of DSA's National Labor Commission and is the former co-chair of New Orleans DSA, Cinzia Arruzza, who is an activist in DSA Emerge and a member of the editorial collective of Viewpoint Magazine and of the editorial board of Spectre, and Haley Pessam, who is a writer for the forthcoming socialist magazine Tempest and a member of the DSA Afro-Socialists and Socialists of Color caucus. And so the way this meeting is going to run is I'm going to go through each of the panelists. They're going to present for about 10 minutes or so. And then we're going to go through and have the panelists respond to each other for 3-minute contributions each. And then we'll open it up for about 30 minutes or so for discussion and questions from other folks in our virtual audience. And I'll explain how that will go right before we enter that section, and then turn it over at the end for wrap-ups from our speakers. So that's kind of the general overview for the meeting. So want to see if the speakers are ready to go, and we're going to start with Justin, and then Michael, Cinzia, and Haley, and we'll go 10 minutes each, and then I'll let y'all know when you have about 2 minutes left in your allotted time, just so you can sort of gauge that, and then when you're at 10 minutes. Of course, doesn't mean stop it, just so you're aware of how much time you've been spending. So with that, Justin, are you ready to begin?
Ready.
Take it away.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So, in the midst of the pandemic, we've seen kind of, and I think not just us as socialists, but I think many people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves radicals in any way, wake up a little bit to the ways in which our society leaves us behind. We've had healthcare workers not having the personal protective equipment that they need, hospital systems kind of stretched beyond their capacity. In New York City, I think we're approaching like 20% unemployment almost. And then you have the question of essential workers who basically have had to put themselves, on the line in order to keep the city running. Those essential workers, many of them, also happen to be Black and brown New Yorkers, which coincides then with the number of the rate of infection and the rate of deaths in the city being disproportionately Black and brown New Yorkers. Added to that, you have the racist enforcement of social distancing against Black and brown New Yorkers by the NYPD. So that's just a bit of the context leading into what happens when Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd. So that happens. I think having seen, cops murder Black people, all too often over many, many years, but, I think most recently in the past decade, you expect like the state to cover for the cops, and you expect the political establishment to not really do all that much about it. And you expect, maybe some kind of gesturing at reforms, but reforms that aren't going to really do anything to keep police from killing Black people. So that's all what's to be expected. What I didn't necessarily expect was to see, in the midst of a pandemic, thousands of people to get out into the streets and kind of, put their lives, on the line to some extent. Not really so much for the pandemic, because I think people have been pretty good, and we've seen that there hasn't been any spikes in COVID as a result of the protests. But putting their lives on the line against violent, brutal policing, we're seeing cops, wearing riot gear, kitted out and with shields and helmets and all sorts of armor. Meanwhile, not too long ago, we had nurses wearing trash bags and recycling their masks. So the protest pops off in Minneapolis. A precinct gets burned to the ground. And then we have protests popping off in cities all over the country, and not just cities, even in rural, predominantly white neighborhoods and suburbs. And then you have people, which is the thing that's most exciting to me, is just everyday people who aren't really radicals, aren't socialists, basically liberals and progressives, kind of saying words like defund and abolish about cops, about the police. So to talk a little bit about policing, it's not all that different in its origin, in my opinion, from what it is today. In the northern cities, as they industrialize, you had a kind of largely immigrant working class that had to be kept in line. You had labor that had to be kept in line. Westward expansion into the frontier and the kind of theft of native land led to the violent enforcement of keeping that land, defending against Native Americans and Mexicans. In the South, you had enslaved Africans and their descendants who had to be kept from escaping or from rebelling. So these are all ways in which policing, in its origin, maintained the social order. So wrangling labor, acquiring the means by which wealth can be created, the protection of that wealth, and all that done with whatever brutality was necessary. That's where we get police from, in a nutshell. Today we have, a kind of vast prison industrial complex, not just police and prisons, but jails, bail, parole, immigration enforcement, detention centers, mental health, coercive mental health treatment facilities, mass media propping this up, nonprofits propping this up, politicians propping this up, any number of business services kind of assisting all of this. So the movement for abolition of police and prisons seeks to not just rid our society of these institutions, but to fundamentally change the conditions which brought them into being. And it's also a lens through which we understand the world and a daily practice of building and strengthening communities. It's how we get free. And I think this is where socialists need to care about abolition and need to consider it seriously. So in practice, abolition is not just about bit by bit, is about both chipping away bit by bit at the oppressive punitive structures that form our carceral state, but also building anew, envisioning anew, figuring out new ways to deal with individual harm and societal harm. So when people often say, well, what are you going to do? You're just going to take away the police. Well, you have to, if you're going to take them away, you have to replace them with something. So this is not just about taking things away. It's about building new things. So we won't be rid of this all tomorrow. abolition is a horizon, and we have to move toward that horizon in the here and now by diminishing the power of the police and prisons over our lives, and through building alternatives. So how do we diminish that power? In the here and now, that means we do so through reforms. What I'm not talking about are the kind of reforms we usually see when a Black man gets killed by the police. So not body cameras and not, technical tinkering. I'm talking about reforms that will fundamentally change things. So those reforms, they have to do 4 things. They have to reduce funding to police and prisons. They have to challenge the notion that police and prisons increase safety. They have to reduce the tools, tactics, technologies that police have at their disposal. And they have to reduce the scale of policing in prisons. Any reform that doesn't do that is not transformative and not abolitionist. It doesn't build the capacity to remove policing from the equation. The kinds of reform, 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Thanks. So the kind of reforms I'm talking about are removing police from hospitals and schools, ending pretrial detention, decriminalizing homelessness, sex work, street economies, drugs, et cetera, ending police and ICE coordination and the criminalization of immigration, closing jails and not building new jails, disaffiliating and disbanding police unions, ending the use of surveillance technology, disarming the police, providing housing, healthcare, and education for all, and finally defunding the police. So in New York and also throughout the country, this is kind of the current fight. To talk a little bit about what's happening in New York. So the 2021 fiscal year budget was just voted on by our city council. There had been, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, all over the country, but here also, demands to defund the police. Specifically, many of the progressive, left liberal nonprofits, some that DSA in New York City, collaborates with frequently, had come up with a demand of $1 billion, cutting the police budget by $1 billion. The police budget is almost $6 billion in New York City. That demand was not met. They came somewhat close to quote unquote defunding by $1 billion. What that actually meant was they moved some money around. They took money that goes from the NYPD budget basically for school safety agents, cops in schools basically. That money came out of the NYPD budget previously, now it comes out of the DOE budget. So they just moved some money around. They didn't really defund the police. So in some ways that means that we lost the fight. But I do think what happened over the course of the past month, DSA, New York City DSA, we had a day of action where we basically put people on the streets in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, going to the homes of council members who were key decision makers on the budget. So we had people go to Corey Johnson's, we had people go, who's the speaker of the council. We had people go to Lori Cumbo, the majority leader's house. We had people go to Dan Drum, another member of the finance committee, the budget committee.
10 minutes, just so you know.
Okay, I'll wrap it up. And they were very displeased with us and made a lot of noise about that. But I think in the process, they also managed to piss off a lot of the Black and brown leaders in the movement to defund the police and to abolish the police by basically erasing them and saying that it was all these white gentrifiers coming and threatening us at our homes by protesting. I think what's interesting is DSA historically has the reputation of being this white organization. And some of those people that are mad about what Lori Cumbo and others said about white gentrifiers being the ones pushing the demand for police, they haven't been happy with us all that much in the past too. But I think what we have an opportunity to do now is to try and, bridge some of that divide in the effort to kind of work together to A, push for the actual defunding of the police for the next budget, but to also educate people in the city about the ways in which police don't keep them safe and basically make it impossible for the city to actually fund the things that allow people to live lives worth living, by actually funding the social services that people need, rather than throwing police at every single problem. I look forward to having a discussion with you all about the rest of this stuff. I'm sorry I didn't use my time as effectively as I could have.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, comrade. So next we'll have Michael.
Hey, y'all. So I am gonna, I didn't prepare a talk, so I'm just gonna kind of wing it. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share a couple anecdotes of things that I've observed and experienced organizing in South Louisiana around the Black Lives Matter uprising. And so some of my observations from that, and then just general lessons I think that socialists should really be taken to heart right now. The first thing, to provide a little bit of context, is that back in 1991, Louisiana had this governor's election, and the two contenders that made it to the runoff election were Edwin Edwards, who had been the former governor of Louisiana, who had been brought up on racketeering and corruption charges, on federal charges, and David Duke, who many people on this call will recognize as one of the most famous white supremacists, former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And David Duke lost by the skin of his teeth. It was just a couple thousand votes. And Edwin Edwards, there was like an unofficial slogan at the time that said, "Vote for the crook, it's important." And so that kind of gives you an idea about what we're up against in Louisiana. It's not easy, it's not pretty. David Duke is from Jefferson Parish, which is right, the neighboring parish, basically a county, right next to New Orleans, and he lives on the North Shore. So really the heart of white supremacy is in Louisiana, but it's also the second blackest state in the country after Mississippi. And we always say, thank God for Mississippi, because if not, we'd be dead last and everything, but at least now we get to compete. So it's not good, but people have been organizing out here a lot, and it's really surprising. I mean, Justin talked about how in a lot of rural communities and white communities, people have been holding Black Lives Matter protests. That's definitely true. I've been trying to document every single protest or rally that's taken place in Louisiana, and pretty much every single parish south of Baton Rouge has had a Black Lives Matter, at least one Black Lives Matter action, including Lafourche Parish, which was the site of the 1887 Thibodeau Massacre, where the Knights of Labor organized thousands of black sugarcane workers, took them out on strike, and then white supremacist vigilante groups went through and slaughtered 300 black women, children, and men. It was one of the most violent labor actions in U.S. history. So that's all here in Louisiana. And I'll share a couple things. We did protest almost every single day the first couple weeks in New Orleans, and I was like, you know what? I don't even really need to be in New Orleans. Like, New Orleans is good. Like, I need to be out in these parishes, because this is where people really want to take action. And it's where the police don't know what the fuck they're doing. They're a bunch of suburban white boys who literally are still in that slave patrol mentality. I'm actually in Gretna, Louisiana, in the parking lot of the Walmart, about to buy some stuff before I go out fishing. And Gretna is the most incarcerated city in the world. Their entire municipal fundraising scheme is based on fines and fees. And so we've been doing a lot of protests out in Gretna. And the last one that I went to, we've probably done like 5 now. The last one that I went to, I talked with Natalia a bit about this, but it escalated as protests do, and people were beaten by the police. They didn't deploy tear gas, but they deployed LRAD, the like sound stuff, and like brought out SWAT trucks. They attacked people. Once the protest ended, they pulled the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office, pulled people over in their cars, busted out their front windshields, and pulled protesters out through their front windshields to arrest them. So it was like one of the most extremely brutal situations I've ever been in my life. Like, fully thought like was just gonna get arrested, but thought I was gonna die. But 2 things I'll say. One, when that specific protest, which I will always remember for the rest of my life, happened, there were different groups. It was organized by families of Black men who have been killed by the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. And so we've been able to connect with about six different families. Some of them want to take a little bit more of a reform approach and have been demanding body cams and things like that and accountability, which is like undefined. Some of them are just like, fuck the police, like defund. So there's contradictions within even the most directly impacted people. When the protest started, we had originally planned it as a rally, but as things, go, it's spontaneous and the people just like, decide what they want to do. And so we started marching and the demand was body cams. By the end of the rally, after we witnessed the police brutality, people were just straight up abolish the police, defund. Like the entire group had really radicalized before our eyes. And I spoke with a man because I had left, we had tried to take the overpass on the highway and then got beaten back by the cops and then went back into the underpass where we completed our rally before the police descended and started attacking and beating protesters as we were attempting to leave. And I had gone to go get some Gatorades for some of the speakers because it's fucking hot out here. It's like 95 degrees all the time in the summer. It's hard to protest. I got my first, as a Black person, my first ever sunburn in the Black Lives Matter protest. I thought I was impervious to this. But anyways, so I got some Gatorades, and on my way back, I'm always just curious, and I like to talk with people. And I saw these two men standing back and watching the protest. And this was the moment when JPSO had brought their tanks out, and they were just yelling basically over their loudspeakers over and over again, "We are here to keep you safe. Do not allow yourself to get arrested. We are here to keep you safe. Do not allow yourself to get arrested." Like on some fascist shit, like straight up. And so I talked with these guys. It was a Black man and a white man. I was like, what do you think about all this? And I said, because I typically don't really lead with the need for global revolution by any means necessary to overthrow the evil capitalist system. So I was like, I don't think we always need to meet violence with violence. And the white guy was like, yeah, I mean, those protesters shouldn't have gone up on that bridge if they didn't want that to happen. And the Black guy was like, what are you talking about? Listen to yourself. Meet violence with violence. This entire nation was founded on violence. And you're going to see that as soon as the working people and the Black people start getting a little bit of something, the guns come out. And then you'll see how good your nonviolence is going to do. And for me, like, yeah, I agree with him. But for me, it wasn't like having someone remind me of that. It was the fact that a random bystander was telling that to me. Somebody who did not come out to participate in that protest, who simply happened to be at a gas station witnessing what was happening and who had that analysis. And that's how I know that people are ready. And what we're seeing right now is completely unprecedented. We're seeing the rapid transformation of every way that people understand race and capitalism, I think. That doesn't mean that we're like solving things necessarily. It means that we're confronting things. And that's something that we as socialists need to really be thinking about. And so now how much time do I have left?
Sorry, I muted myself. You got 3 minutes left.
Okay, so yeah, I'll just transition real quick into like some lessons. I think one thing is that yes, this moment is unique. It's unprecedented. I'm 27. I've never seen anything like this in my entire life. And who knows if it's going to come again, though I do anticipate that once the Bernie bucks run out on July 24th, shit's really going to get real, and then we'll see, But I've never seen anything like this in my life. And so, yes, the times are fucking changing. And the whole idea of gradual change, I think we can see that is not the case. That said, I think, it's so important that we as socialists don't just study the Marxist tradition, like Marxist political and theoretical tradition, but also like our history and like the history of colonization, the history of encapsulation of the commons, the history of exploitation, and like basically the history of the people over profit, the profit over people mindset. Because our communities have been struggling against this shit for 400 years. And we often, as young organizers and as socialists who do possess a unique analysis of history and of the economy, we tend to walk into situations with arrogance, thinking that we have the right answers. So like, obviously, when I started organizing with families in Jefferson Parish who've lost sons to the police, I was like, fuck yeah, I believe in abolishing the police. I don't think that institution can be reformed. And they were like, well, we want body cams. And I was like, look, as a labor organizer, sometimes you have to let people realize and make their own decisions by themselves. Like, you can't really come into a community and tell them what you think is best for their community until you've been in the trenches and struggled alongside them. And so there's a reason that DSA is not leading in this moment. And there's a reason that DSA shouldn't lead in this moment. And that's because we haven't been doing the work. And I think that this is a great opportunity for us to really reckon with that and to ask ourselves, what is it going to take to build a real movement of the working class to really dig into the class itself and to meet people where they're at and be struggling in every single place, including New York City, including New Orleans, but also like out in the fucking cut in the bayou, like way down deep South Louisiana where people get lynched still to this day. And so I'm going to close out with a little quote from one of my friends that I've been really using a lot because I think it's really sharp. She's actually in Central Brooklyn chapter. And she said, "These revolts are not unique. They have similarities to a number of others in both US history and world history generally. I know it can feel overwhelming, but they will end. And then we have to decide whether they will be remembered as just another revolt over police killings or as a kind of February revolution against the racist police system and the system of racial capitalism. How we build on them will be just as, if not more important. It really is up to us." And so our role as socialists right now is to not necessarily like be on the mic or to be walking into the situations, like formulating what the demands need to be. I think that our role is to go to people who are experiencing an intense moment of radicalization and like whose eyes are being opened, to support them, to build deep partnership and like to really start being in the trenches and struggling with the working class. And once we've done that, we will build the credibility, and we'll also, honestly, we'll learn ourselves, because organizing is a two-way street. And you can think you know a lot of stuff, but until you actually go out and speak with communities that are dealing with police violence and dealing with the shit every single day, you really don't know. And so that's something that I've been realizing myself a lot, in sometimes extraordinary and sometimes deeply painful ways. But that's organizing. So yeah.
Dope. Thanks so much, Michael. So now I'll turn over to Cinzia Arruzza.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this debate. And I'm going to start from some of the things Michael said, especially with regard to what are the challenges that socialist organizations, in particular the DSA, have faced and are facing within this context. So first of all, as already mentioned, obviously this Black Rebellion was not only a unique moment, but probably one of the largest social revolts in the whole history of the United States. So this is the scope with which we are dealing. So in other words, this was not just a social explosion, a social movement and so on. It was really like a deep-rooted social rebellion responding to the combination of combined crisis from the pandemic to the history of institutionalized racism, to the economic crisis accelerated by the pandemic and so on. So from this viewpoint, and what contributed also to the magnitude of the radicalness of the revolt was also the fact that this revolt comes after 10 years process of increasing radicalization within US society, increasing radicalization, especially of new generations of activists, and increasing polarization of the political debate, due also to Trump's presidency. So from this viewpoint, obviously this revolt opened enormous potentialities. So in other words, there was let's say the objective potentiality for a sustained long-term level, high level of social conflict and class conflict. The problem is that what was missing and what is still missing, and we are of course trying to work on this, was the other component, that is the subjective one. So in other words, what was missing was the presence of revolutionary subjectivities, meaning organizations capable of intervening within the social revolt in an effective way, not to take up the leadership from an external viewpoint and so on, but rather to work within the revolt to make to open spaces for the emergence of a new revolutionary Black leadership from below, Black leadership from below, working inside the revolt to push towards the expansion, the social expansion of the revolt. Just to give an example, the involvement within the revolt of organized labor and not only formally organized labor, but also like the embryonic forms of new organizations, of new labor organizations that we have seen at work, for example, during the pandemic crisis. Amazon workers walking out in protest against unsafe conditions and so on. So from this viewpoint, I would say that what was missing was, on the one hand, a robust organizational infrastructure, a pre-existing robust organizational infrastructure that could put itself at the service of this movement. And on the other hand, a political revolutionary subjectivity capable of devising strategies and proposing these strategies within the movement itself. Now, within this context, I think we should make a distinction between working in solidarity with a protest and being able to intervene in a protest from a strategic perspective. So in other words, the DSA did enormous, a number of chapters of the DSA and activists in the DSA did enormous work in support of the protest. They were out in the streets, they were organizing mutual aid, they were also organizing protests and so on and so on. And this was fundamental, important work in solidarity with the protest, and work that was necessary not only for the protests, but it was also necessary for DSA activists themselves in order to learn what it means to participate in a mass social rebellion, and also in order to learn something more about the history of Black, specifically Black struggle, Black rebellion, and Black debates. At the same time, however, this level of intervention was, in my view, insufficient if compared with the level of challenge that was posed to us as socialists by the social rebellion. So in other words, in a moment of extreme acceleration of political time, in a moment in which all various contradictions not only explode, but really are condensed and become much more transparent to people, much more visible. What Justin was saying earlier about how the pandemic made a lot of social contradictions much more visible, more transparent to people. In this moment, the level of intervention that would have been required from socialists should have been a level of, again, ability of really having a strategic analysis of the situation, identifying the potentialities and the challenges and the problems and the possible risk, and having the infrastructural means to intervene within that context. I don't think we are at that point yet. So I think this is an ability that also as DSA we really need to start building. Now, from this viewpoint, because I don't want to speak too long, and I think I have only 3 minutes left. I think moving forward and looking at what is ahead of us, we could take into account a few elements. The first one is that I do believe that this social revolt is actually part of a long process of radicalization and political polarization. So this is not the end. So even although we didn't really realize all the potentialities that there were in this social revolt, this is not the end of the story. I think we are in a global process, not only in the United States, but in a global process of increased political polarization. But this also means that we will have the repetition of moments of acceleration of events, such as the ones we just experienced. So in other words, one of the problems organizationally and politically as a socialist organization that we need to take into account is that we cannot devise our strategies and our political work only in terms of long-term, slow organizing and accumulation of forces. Why? Because this is not, in my view, the predominant political context that is ahead of us. I think the context that is ahead of us is a context in which there will be social explosions. in the United States and outside of the United States. There will be accelerations. And so one of the first issues to address is what kind of organizational forms, what kind of organizational mechanisms and decision-making processes we should devise in order to be able to be up to the task. So in other words, in order to be able to do, yes, the slow work of organizing in regular times, but also be ready for the acceleration that is to come. The second element, which is more specific to the US context, is that, in my view, I mean, the class struggle has always been mediated by race in the United States for obvious reasons. This is becoming increasingly so. So in other words, if we want to know what class struggle is in the United States, what the class is, not just class struggle is in the United States today, well, the class is highly gendered and highly racialized. And the way in which the class fights back, and will fight back also in the future, will very often be mediated by, for obvious and absolutely justified reasons, by gender and racial politics. So from this viewpoint, the second enormous task we have is that of really revising our own culture. So this is something Michael was suggesting. So in other words, we really need to learn much more from the history and the tradition of Black radicalism in the United States, of anti-racist and anti-imperialist struggles around the world. And we need to integrate this in our analysis of the way in which capitalism works in the United States and of the way in which class relations work in the United States. And secondly, which means also really fighting back against any form of economic reductionism, which unfortunately is still very much present also in our organizing, because economic reductionism in this context represents a fundamental obstacle to revolutionary politics. I'm going to say this really bluntly. But the second element, and I end here, is also the necessity of actively working on promoting Black, brown, and racialized socialist leadership. So in other words, one of the problems, one of the limitations, and we saw this also in New York in some instances of our organizational efforts. One of the problems, for example, in relation to the DSA, is not only the racial composition of the organization, but the racial composition also of the leadership. Now, this is a problem that needs to be addressed with some urgency, because again, I do think that this is the shape that class struggle is taking and is going to take in the future. So, I mean, there are also various other reasons why we should have, promote Black leadership and brown leadership and so on. But even from the simple viewpoint of our ability to actually be an actor within the struggles ahead of us, I think that the active promotion of a socialist, informational socialist Black revolutionary leadership is an absolutely necessary and urgent task. And I will end here.
Great, thanks, comrade. So we'll go to Haley next, and just before Haley goes, after Haley's done, we're gonna go back through the panelists for responses. And so you can put your thinking caps on and just like 3 minutes or like just 1 point. So we'll go back through with Justin, Michael, Cinzia, and then Haley. And so if there's something that one of the other panelists said that you like sparked something you wanted to add or something you disagreed with, or sort of roundabout, sort of a moment for you to be able to respond to stuff the other panelists have said. So after Haley makes her presentation, we'll go back through with Justin, Michael, Cinzia, and Haley for kind of 3-minute responses to the other panelists, and then we'll open it up for conversation and questions from other folks who are here with us. So with that, Haley, take it away.
All right, thanks so much, comrades. I really appreciate all the discussion we've had so far. I'll just take a moment to say, since I am part of Tempest Magazine, typically these discussions I think happen in different organizations or in separate caucuses or working groups, and there's very few spaces where we get to have these strategic discussions out in the open. So I'm hoping that's something that we can begin to continue, because I think that moments like this actually call for more strategic discussion and debate, and if we're actually going to figure out how to respond to a historic uprising against anti-Black racism and police brutality in a way that really takes that struggle forward. So as folks have already spoken to, on the one hand, this uprising has done more in a matter of a month of really continuous protests to shift the political terrain in the United States than decades of really any other political force. And I really agree with Cinzia that this is a continuation of a process of radicalization that's really been catalyzed, at least by the economic crisis of 2008, and it's continued. And we can expect different iterations of that. But for all the ways these protests mirror the demonstrations that followed after the revolt against police terror in Ferguson, Missouri 6 years ago, it's already clear that these protests have gone much further in terms of being more militant, more widespread, more multiracial, and receiving greater solidarity. I think if any of us have been on the protests, it's very clear to see just how much support there is, but then there's also the empirical evidence of things like the New York Times article showing that 15 to 26 million people have been part of these protests, which would make it the largest in US history. On the other hand, these protests have been mostly led by Black youth, and with some exceptions like in Chicago and other pockets of the country, I would say that most of them have not been led by existing organizations, Black-led or otherwise. And this is ultimately a challenge because it doesn't provide spaces for new people coming into activity and making these radical conclusions to plug in and to figure out how do we actually wage a struggle that really is going to be a long-term struggle, because the nature of racism in this society is so deep-rooted, and also because the forces that want the police to maintain their power so that the capitalist class can maintain its power is not going to just roll over and let this happen. So that's not just a problem for this particular struggle, it's a challenge for the entire left, which has only really begun to overcome 40 years of the decimation or even co-optation of institutions of working class struggle. And so this brings me to the central question of what is the role of socialists in these movements, and specifically in the struggle against anti-Black racism. So first, I think, just to put a fine point on it, because racism is so central to the functioning of capitalism, it means that resistance to racism, particularly anti-Black racism in the US, never stops with a struggle around equal rights. It has always raised bigger questions about the structure of society. And I think we're seeing that even more deeply for all the reasons that Justin mentioned during a pandemic. Because if you look at who is most facing the consequences of this pandemic on top of police brutality, it's Black people who are most likely to be in jobs where they cannot work from home, and they're therefore more exposed to COVID-19. It's Black communities that are dying disproportionately from the pandemic, and also from the effects of the previous disinvestment in Black communities in terms of healthcare, in terms of education, in terms of any number of factors. And so it's no surprise in some ways that this is the leading element of this struggle, both against the impact of the pandemic and specifically against anti-Black racism and police repression. But the other factor of this in general about social movements is that they represent the height of mass activity, and they're the point at which people are open to the most radical ideas, and there's the greatest potential for winning transformative, if not revolutionary, change. And so I really appreciate the anecdote that Michael had about ordinary people basically saying today things that the left has been saying for decades. But it's not enough for us to just say it. There has to be a context in which people can actually see those ideas in action and see why they resonate and come to those conclusions on their own. So to me, what's important about social movements and that specific self-activity component in movements is that people come to realize the limits of the institutions as they are. And when we typically say that we just need to vote this person or that person out of office in order to get change, instead, we're actually seeing kind of incredible changes in terms of the police departments being gutted from schools, or from, even in Minneapolis, the discussion of dismantling the police department. That's clearly something that wouldn't have happened without the scale of rebellion by ordinary people that we're seeing today. So I think our job as socialists is to help develop struggles as far as they can go. But to do that, we actually have to be in the struggle to begin with. And that includes all its messiness, all its debates on tactics and strategy, where it's possible to actually decide and figure out the way forward. And so this brings me to the question of DSA, which Cinzia spoke to a bit, and which a lot of us are members of. I don't think it's controversial to anyone to say that we were not at all prepared for this struggle. I mean, perhaps no one could have been prepared, but we also did not jump in to the struggle until very late in the game, and we're very much delayed in responding to it. And even to this day, we failed to create any kind of national infrastructure on the scale of, say, what existed around the Sanders campaign to actually coordinate and try to really see this struggle as a central feature of activity. And so I think what the uprising revealed are really three key weaknesses in the strategy that's dominated the DSA until now. The first is electoralism. So despite some attention to the uprisings or even the role of the police, there's certainly a wing of the DSA, and I would argue the dominant wing, that has not fundamentally broken with its previous strategy, which says that if we support and win candidates to office who can give us a wider platform for ideas that are already popular but opposed by centrist Democrats, we can raise people's expectations and have a ready-made base for socialism. The problem with this formula is that there's a big difference between raising expectations or even good demands and actually strengthening our side in the arenas where we have the social power to win those demands. And of course, I think that's iterated in ways that people have continued to fixate on Sanders, however important his role may have been, in that he opposes the main demand of the movement. And I think getting him to, say the right thing right now is not the main factor in what happens next. It's whether we're able to actually build movements that are strong enough to win demands, even against politicians far more conservative than Sanders. So where elections do advance the left, or even though I believe elections have an important role in advancing the left, those successes on their own can't actually change the balance of class forces. Only movements and labor struggle can do that, and developing long-term organization that can help preserve some of the lessons and build on the foundation of previous struggles, whether we have victories or defeats. The second factor, I think, in weaknesses of the DSA is economic reductionism. This is a wing that dismisses the struggle almost entirely and tends to counterpose struggles around race and class. And this is utterly to the detriment of the socialist movement in making clear that these struggles are fundamentally connected, or that we have anything to offer the biggest uprising that we've seen in decades. We certainly can't afford to be on the sidelines. But we also can't win any kind of unity if we're not willing to fight tooth and nail against what has been the most effective barrier in the United States to unity within the working class. So if we are trying to win a unity that is based on universal demands without dismantling racism, which exists at every level of society to prevent any kind of real unity, we are not going to win even those demands, much less a socialist society.
2 minutes, comrade.
Thank you. So the final weakness I would say is moralism, which I would describe as a view that this struggle is actually crucial and is something that Cinzia spoke to. People in DSA are absolutely participating in these struggles, but I think there's a sense that DSA can't play any kind of active role in these struggles, primarily because the DSA is so overwhelmingly white. And that's not an irrelevant barrier. I think that the question is, how do we overcome that and make this organization actually reflective of the working class as it is in all its diversity and all of its racial composition, and in particular in terms of the people who are actually leading and are in the vanguard of this struggle right now. And I think that the problem with simply fixating on how white DSA is that while it comes from a good intention, in practice, it doesn't allow us to effectively challenge the electoralist arguments or the reductionists in a meaningful way. So the organized forces of the left need to find ways to participate and contribute to and actually build these protests with our name on them, not on the protest, but as an active participant. We should know that DSA actually cares enough about these protests to want to help find avenues of struggle that will help these movements actually succeed in the long run. And so the final thing I'll say is there's also this argument, of course, that we need to follow Black leadership. And I think that's important, but it also matters which Black leadership that we're talking about. about, because we're already seeing the beginnings of the demand to defund the police being watered down in New York. That has looked like the Black, Latino, Asian caucus lining up completely behind a defund bill that has nothing to do with community demands. And so I think that we have to be conscious of the class differences that exist and of the different ideas and debates that exist amongst people who are struggling against racism and within the broader social movement versus who's considered the leadership in quotes. Instead, I think we need to create as many democratic spaces as possible. And I would say with 70,000 members, it's very possible that we could be helping to do that in every single part of the country. And we absolutely should do that. So we need to have an organization that's far more flexible in responding to these uprisings when they occur, and more importantly, has a long-term vision that says when these uprisings disappear, we still want the leadership and the people who've learned these lessons to be one to the struggle for socialism, to be integrated into our organizations, and to be helping us to lead the next steps. So I'll end with that.
Thanks, Haley. So with all those massive questions out there from our fantastic contributions from our panelists, we'll go back through and y'all can make responses to other things that other panelists have said. So again, like 3 minutes, keep it real, sort of brief, one excellent point so we can have some time to hear from other people with us. And so we'll go Justin, followed by Michael. And so, roughly 3 minutes responses to stuff other people have said. Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, thanks, comrades. That was great. A couple of things that stood out to me that got me thinking. What Michael said about what socialists, engaged in this struggle for Black liberation against police brutality, what we should be learning, what we're learning within these struggles, I think is really important. And I think, at least in my experience, I think, and this touches on some of what Haley said. I think there is a kind of instinct to kind of like feel weird and awkward about whiteness when entering these spaces. I'm speaking for the overwhelmingly white DSA members in entering these spaces, and not that discomfort preventing people from like actually engaging in the work. And it's just kind of like, okay, you're going to be uncomfortable, deal with it. To what Cinzia was saying about, but I'm interested to hear a little bit more about those lessons that need to be learned, Michael. In terms of organization, what Cinzia was talking about, I think this is really true. I think we have many more crises ahead of us. And organizationally, what does it look like to have an organization that simultaneously has the centralization and structure to respond meaningfully, but also has the flexibility, the nimbleness to actually adapt to local circumstances. Haley, what you said about the problems with DSA that kind of made it a little bit flat-footed in its response to this, I think we're spot on. I think, I might catch some shit from people for this, but I think the DSA in some ways does not know what it is without Bernie. And I think we need to figure it out. And I think this is a really great opportunity for us to figure it out, what DSA is without Bernie. I think we're being shown a real way in which Black and brown folks experience their class exploitation and oppression through police violence. And the problems you're talking about with regard to economic reductionism and moralism, because yes, this is a moral fight, but like also it's a strategic fight. It's a strategic fight to actually care about the ways in which Black and brown folks experience their oppression as it relates to capitalism. So no, it's not just us being good people. This is like how we win. We should be serious about winning. I'm out of time, but DSA is going to be having an abolition working group and trying to establish some kind of national defund something. As I find out more, I can plug books in, but I can like pass some URLs for the chat. I'll stop. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, comrade. So Michael, you're next. You messaged that you had technical difficulties. Are you able to hop on?
Yes, I figured it out.
Okay,
Unfortunately, unfortunately, I missed most of what Justin said, so sorry, Justin. But I wanna talk. I think I agree with a lot of what Haley was saying. I think that at least in my own chapter, we're like 90% white or something like that in a city that's 60% black, and like, to be honest, this is such a weird paralysis that I think DSA experiences around racial issues, where we just get so like caught up in our head that we're like not able to actually like take real action, and we just like descend into these like bizarre kind of like theoretical, confusing conversations about how to like engage with the Black struggle. And it's like, bro, like the answer is simple. Go on to a protest, find out who's organizing it, and build a relationship with them. Like, organize. Like, that's it, right? It's just organizing. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like we, DSA, often, it's hilarious because we approach situations with an immense degree of arrogance, being a mostly young organization and being people who are often trained to organize out of arrogance by the society that kind of puts them in a higher position than people of color or other marginalized identity groups. But we also don't, a lot of times, like, most of us have only been in this fight for 3 or 4 years. We don't really know what we're doing. And so, like, people are going to fuck up and make mistakes, but that's good. And what I always tell our members is that, you can fuck up and make mistakes. It's actually a really positive and productive thing, because that's what organizing is all about. The only thing that you can't do is make the same mistake twice. And so, I think, like, we just really need to be out there, like, be in the streets. This is the most important thing that's happening in our society right now. And if people don't recognize that, then they're not really Marxists. And so, yeah, we just need to be out there and be building relationships with impacted folks. And the only other thing that I'll say is, like, about the following Black leadership. Again, that I think, agreeing with Haley, it can often be a cop-out against, like, being it's like people who are like, we just need to follow Black leadership, rather than like really do the historical and theoretical like legwork to understand what's going on. Because I just have to say, I don't know how it is in other places, but in Louisiana, the Black political class arose in the 1970s out of the civil rights and Black liberation struggles. Those people are not fighting for Black workers at all, period. And so we just really need to keep our eyes open and like be clear about what we're doing here. And that's the fight for the multiracial working class that currently the Black struggle is leading. And so we need to center the Black struggle and focus on how we support and sustain the Black struggle. But at the end of the day, like, don't get it twisted. Not all skin folk are kinfolk. So that's all.
Excellent. Thanks, comrade. So Cinzia, followed by Haley.
Yeah, and I don't really have a response. Just I want to stress just a couple of points. First of all, I'm totally in agreement with what Justin said about the balance between having both flexibility, so maintaining the flexibility that actually allowed the DSA to grow, because basically DSA became a house for socialists, let's say, with very different politics, or very different orientations and so on. And this actually was good and is still good. So the very delicate balance is that between maintaining this level of openness and flexibility, while also putting in place instruments that allow us to make national decisions and to intervene. So Haley, for example, suggested, pointed out to something absolutely crucial, which is that, the DSA should have created some kind of national infrastructure, a working group and so on, just for the intervention within coordinating the intervention in the protest and coordinating the discussion about this, the way in which he did for the Sanders campaign. And it's symptomatic that this didn't happen. So I think this is something we really need to insist on moving forward. On the issue of Black leadership, I would like to say, I think the issue is a bit complicated. So in other words, I do think that one of the elements of that allow democratic liberal hegemony for decades within the United States was precisely the ability to co-opt a layer of Black leaders and to basically push in the direction of the NGOification of large part of what was the Black movement and so on. Now, this also means that they are very well equipped. Every time there is the explosion of a protest, like this, they are very well equipped to intervene. This time they had a bit more trouble because of the expansion of the scope, the magnitude, and radicalness of the protest. So it was not limited only to Minneapolis, but actually exploded everywhere and so on. So it took them a bit more time, and also they had to yield a bit more than in the past. So, look at the New York, articles published in the New York Times now. It's unbelievable. But they are managing to do it anyway. Why? Because they do have the tools to do it. Now, how do you respond to this? I do agree, of course, multiracial leadership and so on and so on. But in my view, I'm quite pessimistic that we can actually address this problem without really countering the democratic ability to co-opt this layer of Black leaders with the promotion from below of the emergence of revolutionary Black and brown leadership. I don't think we are, because otherwise, what is going to happen in the coming months is quite clear to me, and it is that in November there are the elections. They are already starting, and they have, they already started at the very beginning with the white outside agitator fantasy and so on. What we saw at the beginning of the protest is nothing compared to what we are going to see in the coming months, since the social protest is fading. So basically, there will be a relentless attack on socialists for their whiteness, for being outside agitators. How do you respond to this? And in my view, really, there is no other solution than to actually do the work of attracting and promoting revolutionary Black leaders.
Thanks, comrade. Haley, and then we'll open it up for discussion, and I'll explain how we're going to do that after Haley's comments. Go ahead, Haley.
Right, I'll be brief. Yeah, I really agree with what Cinzia just said. I think that it's challenging because what I suppose I'm speaking from a specific experience, which is just of the Afro-Socialist caucus in New York. But, I'm curious what the experience has been like elsewhere. What I have found is that the Afro-Socialist caucus often is the only sort of obvious DSA presence at any of these rallies. And it's good and bad in that, yes, there are Black leaders in this movement in DSA who are intervening in this struggle to some extent, but they're doing so without the resources of the entire organization. They're doing so almost, I can't tell you guys how many talks I've been on, but I'm sure I'm not the only person who feels incredibly stretched. And I think that there's the reason I feel that the moralism and the economic reductionism and the electoralism are the specific points that I raise is because I think there are different reasons that is falling so heavily on the shoulders of a small layer of Black cadre, rather than us being in a position to reach out and develop and work with a larger layer of people who have come into these struggles. And I think some of them are political arguments, some of them are structural, and I think they're certainly connected in different ways. But I think that one challenge of overcoming that is that the whole organization, including its white members, including its non-Black members, has to see this struggle as central. And so that means that those resources, those activities, those things can't be limited to the Afro-Socialist caucus. They have to be much more widespread. And even if within that there's a conscious effort, which I think there absolutely should be, to recruit the new people who are coming into struggle, the new Black revolutionaries who are being developed, it's not going to happen without that conscious understanding that this is all of our struggle to take part. And this is something that is actually going to matter whether the socialist left takes a clear position and clear activity within. So I guess I think that's sort of the relationship between a very complicated issue, because obviously this is nothing new. So I also just agree with Michael. I so appreciate how bluntly and specifically you were about what this is. This is just organizing. It's not something different in some ways. I think that DSA is very used to us doing these things through door knocking or through, the kind of specific type of activity that you do when you're campaigning for office or whatever. But really, being part of the movement gives us an opportunity to meet people who are already doing a lot of important work and who can actually strengthen us. So I think that's a sort of talent and a tactic that we need to generalize.
Great. Thanks, comrade. So speaking of spaces for discussion, I'm going to open it up for a little bit of discussion here. We have about 20 minutes or so.